All right, how are you guys doing?
Sure.
You guys ready, more or less? Okay, good to see you. We're going to really go through a lot today, so we're just going to jump right into it. This is where we're going. We're going to start with the people group approach, really looking at what a people group is, where this sort of style of looking at missions as a strategy sort of came from contextually, and then we're going to look at the task remaining. So in light of God's meta-narrative from beginning to end, where are we, right? What needs to be completed until we get to the and then of Matthew 24? And then we're going to look at our engagements as an organization in sort of that context, right? So this is where we left off, that the gospel of the kingdom needs to be preached throughout the world to all nations before Jesus comes back, right? We know that the crux of the Great Commission is the command to go and make disciples of all nations. We briefly talked about this. I mentioned it a little bit at the end of the last class, right? That all nations in Greek means pantata ethne, pan being your same prefix that you'd use for words like pandemic or Pangea, meaning all. Okay? Ta meaning the, and ethne being related to ethnicity. Basically, all the ethnicities, all the peoples is a better translation for it. Really, what it's getting to is almost like this familial level. Almost all the families is like an accurate translation. We know it's not referring to countries as we know them today because those borders didn't exist back when this language was used. Empires and countries have changed over time. This sort of gives us a lens by which we can better understand this word as it's used in the Scripture. Importantly, this is the phrase that's used consistently throughout the Bible in terms of a promise of fulfillment. Every time it's talked about like all nations being gathered around the end, or the gospel being preached to all nations, or something of that nature, this is the phrase that's used. Really important is that it's indicative of totality. Like preachers will say, like in the original Greek, like the word "all" means all, right? Like that's what it means. It means all. It means every people, right? So we know that it's going to happen in fullness, and I'll touch back a little bit on it in a minute. We referenced this verse a lot last week. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Where is this exactly?
Genesis 12.
Good, it's in the Bible, in Genesis 12. Good, this is the old covenant that was given to Abram, right? Yeah, this is the old covenant given to Abram, part of the three parts, part of the land, the descendants, and the blessing, that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We talked about this verse a lot last week in terms of it as a promise, right? That God was making this covenant with people, that he will do this. But in addition to that, it was almost as much a promise as it was a mandate. Right? It was God's invitation in the Jews to be the vessel by which his blessing extended. It was not all nations will be blessed through you, but you will also bless all nations as a people. Right? It was this command to be that blessing as much as it was a promise that it would happen. Right? And we know through history that this was again and again and again not done through them. Time and time again they turned towards things like ethnocentrism or inclusivism or just like rejection of outsideness. Right? That kind of disallowed this from happening. Okay, cool. Moving forward, we have this principle in the Bible of this sort of 12 and 70. When you guys think of the number 12 in the Bible, what immediately comes to mind? The disciples or the tribes. Good. So 12 is the number that's most often used in reference to Israel. It's the Jewish number. So anytime you see 12, think Israel. 70, on the other hand, is the number that's used in reference to the fullness of Gentiles. And you see this a few times, and it's actually really cool. You see this in the Table of Nations. Okay, when you have, what's his name, Noah getting off the boat and his 3 children go, and that lists sort of all the ethnicities that come from them. You count them up and there's 70 of them. This meaning sort of the fullness of the earth's peoples. When you have Jacob's 12 sons being brought into Exodus and into Egypt at the beginning of Exodus, you have the 12 sons and it says there's 70 descendants with them. And what this sets up is that the deliverance will come not just to Jews but also to all Gentiles as well. It's this really cool, almost prophecy. And then you have Matthew 10, which we reference all the time around here. What is Matthew 10? Seth saying it. Yeah, it's the short-term journey that he sends the 12 on, right? Like, take nothing with you, go to the lost tribes of Israel, whatever. And then you have it again, that other short-term journey in Luke 10, where he sends the 70 out, right? The principle is the same. First to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. First sending the 12 to the people of Israel, then the 70 representing the fullness of nations being brought in. So it's this really cool kind of dichotomy there that's really present throughout all of Scripture. I know I'm moving super quick. But When you then get to Acts, right, and the Spirit descends at Pentecost, the command is to go and preach the gospel, first in Jerusalem, then in Judea, then in Samaria, then in the ends of the earth. You're probably familiar with this. Most often we focus on just this part, thinking like first in my hometown, then in like the neighboring or maybe, what's the word, there's the country next door that maybe we're not friends with, and then the ends of the earth. But really what I think is really helpful in framing this is that it starts with Jerusalem. Jerusalem then being at the time like the center of economic activity, the center of political activity. You had people there from all different ethnicities, speaking different languages, doing trade in their languages, right? And we know this, when the Spirit at Pentecost came, the first thing it did was allow the disciples to be understood by people in all those languages, right? It says in the scripture, people from all languages were there, understanding the disciples in their own tongues. So it's super cool. What this does, one, I think it sets up two things. One, none of the disciples were from Jerusalem, right? And so when he says start here, it's sort of re-emphasizing the importance of this isn't just a Jewish gospel, but an international gospel in a sense, right? This is for all peoples. My first act is to make it understood by all peoples. Okay? And then second, so it decentralizes this promise. It kind of removes the Jewishness of that gospel right from the start. And then it sort of decentralizes the means of the gospel spreading. And by what I mean is this, that all of those people who would have heard the gospel in their own language would then have returned, right, to where they were originally from. And so you have this pocket of understanding that exists all over what was then the Roman Empire before the disciples ever left, before the early church ever scattered. And this sort of sets up, in a sense, this concept that we don't need to go and bring something to lost people that, God is unable to reconcile without us, but that God is actually already doing work among all peoples, and that we go to join him in the work he's already doing. And this helps us as Americans, as missionaries, as people living like Christ-following lives. It helps us avoid things like the no white savior complex. It helps us avoid things like the ethnocentrism or the Americanness of our own gospel, that I'm bringing something that somebody else is lacking. Right? We know that God is already at work in every people group, bringing about eventually, the fruit of that people group to be in relationship with himself. So we go to join God in the work he's already doing. You might know this, you might not, that in 2019, every single country in the world has believers in it. Okay, that wasn't the case even as early as 50 years ago. But once you really get to the fall of the Soviet Union, and in the 70s, there was a big people group push to go and really bring the gospel everywhere. That now from the 70s on, really, especially the early 90s, is when you stop seeing countries that are totally unreached, totally without Christian presence. But what you do see is still a lot of big blotches, big gaps in where the gospel is. And some areas and regions are much more unreached than others. So I say all that to say this is the principle we want to impart to participants, right? That we're not going to reach and to save necessarily. It's God that does that. But we're just going to join God in the work that he's already doing among people. All right. I include this too. This is a map of points plotted of every single one of the disciples' presumed deaths. This is where we think they all died. This is the natural result of community and intimacy within the proper context of missional purpose. All right, this is what it looks like when you have community with believers and intimacy with the Lord in the purpose of being missional, in the purpose of what God commanded, what he's invited us into doing. Right? You see all 12 of them spread across the extent of the world as they knew it. All right, and so I just say that to say that this is the potential there. Okay, we're going to go through some history to really set up where we're at today. The point of this is looking at where the gospel started. Right, started in Jerusalem, right, and where it is now. How did we get to where we are today? Is that okay? Am I going too fast? Any questions, thoughts?
Who died in India?
It was Thomas? Is that right? Yeah, it's presumed that Thomas was martyred in India. And there's actually southern Indians who will trace their Christian heritage all the way back to him, through their families. It's not. I don't know if that's confirmed or not. But that's what it's thought. Okay. Cool. Thanks. Okay. The gospel spread in a lot of ways, but it wasn't super intentional outside the start of the early church. You guys might know this, but the gospel starting in Jerusalem, the early church, how did it spread initially? You guys know?
Persecution.
Yeah, it was persecution. Good. So persecution fell on the church in Jerusalem, and all the early church scattered. right? And that's how the initial spread of the gospel happened throughout Rome. You have this as an overlay of the Roman Empire with the Christian presence just 200 years after the death of Christ. And you see how kind of much overlap there is. By 300 or so, the Christianity was adopted as the official religion of Rome. It was that prevalent. It was sort of like a, what's the word, when you just sort of count your losses. The Roman, it was like one of like, we can't fight against them, we might as well join them sort of a thing. So you see this, that like the gospel is transferring a lot through empire, through politics at this time. I don't have this on the map, but the Vikings, much later now, but the Vikings who were in Scandinavia actually acquired the gospel by invading Europe, taking a bunch of people, no, seriously, taking a bunch of women to be like sex slaves and whatnot. They, in their houses, after a couple generations, like Christianized the Vikings. That's how the gospel like, spread throughout the north of Europe, right? Not like an intentional missionary activity, but just through empire and politics, essentially. Hey, the gospel spread by trade a lot as well. You guys know these. You might know these. What would you call these routes? The Silk Road, the old Silk Road. Good. So this was the sort of the trade route that connected the east to the west. A lot of ideas or philosophies, literal goods would travel and flow along these routes. You had merchants who were Christianized, who had known the gospel. You had Nestorian monks who were like walking like in 600 AD and would like settle around here. There's an ancient history in China. You can actually find artifacts of there being existence of the gospel. There's even like Chinese characters that derive like their meaning from like biblical or gospel things, right? And that's because of this. Because 1400 years ago, people were trading along the Silk Road and ideas were making their way. We actually have a ministry in Kazakhstan that we work with, that Patrick set up, that does archaeological digs in Kazakhstan to prove to Kazakhs that there was a Christian history in that region before Islam. So in Kazakhstan, like to be Kazakh is to be Muslim, so for them to have the burden of proof that there was actually Christian presence there is this huge bridge to the gospel. It's super cool. Okay, you jump forward to the 1600s or so, and the gospel starts spreading intentionally, at this point intentionally through colonialism. There were a lot of issues with colonialism. It's probably like the worst way, missionally practice-wise, one could spread the gospel. Most missionaries were sent with mixed motives from, what are they called? Empires? Countries, whatever, that had mixed motives, right? Places were colonialized. People were almost force converted to Christianity the way that the colonialists were practicing at that point. Worship in our language, worship in our style. There was no contextualization, hardly at all. It wasn't actually very good. But what you start seeing is the presence of Christian, like political Christian spots, presences along the coastlines. Okay, and this is what's referred to as the first era of intentional missional history, right? Of the gospel appearing along the coastlines in a lot of colonialist places. So you have India that was colonialized by the British. You have the east coast of China. You start seeing pockets in Southeast Asia from the French and the British as well. You have Dutch places in Indonesia, Portuguese places along the east coast of Africa, etc. Obviously, Spain colonized a lot, and Portugal colonized a lot of South America as well. So you start seeing this happening. You start seeing like monks and Jesuit priests and stuff joining the colonialist movement. A lot of people were very pure in their intention. A lot of the systems behind them were very impure. If that makes sense. Okay. Jump forward a little bit. This sort of represents the next era of missions history where the gospel was more brought inland. Okay, it was first to the coastlands, then inland. You have like a lot of in China and in India, like really big missional movements at this point in time. Maybe you guys have heard of people like Hudson Taylor or William Carey. Hudson Taylor started in Shanghai and moved inland when he sort of had the revelation that there are still 1 billion Chinese people inland that have never had access to the gospel. And he was much more intentional in how he brought the gospel about. So he would actually, he had a big belly, had the full goatee, shaved his head. He spoke like 7 dialects of Chinese or something like that. He wrote translations of the Bible that we still use today. It's just really amazing, sort of his legacy there. But that was sort of the next big thing from like 1800 till 50 years ago, right? Where it was from the colonialist places on the outsides, on the coastlines of countries, more inland. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? And we get to today. I want to just emphasize that this is a really reductive map. This is more of a political map than a religious map. It's showing almost Christianity as a political entity or as like a country identity, and like there's some really glaring things that I think are misleading on this map. Like, I wouldn't consider India Christian. This is a heritage of the British Empire ruling India, right? So there were churches, large Anglican or Catholic or whatever Baptist churches in major cities in India. There was that colonialist sort of heritage of like nearly 200 years of rule, but we're not going to consider these Christian countries, if that makes sense, yeah.
So your previous slide for with communism, what was the religious? I know there's like the Russian Orthodox Church, but what was like the religious atmosphere? And because then how does that like continue on with the fall of the bloc and all the Eastern European countries and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so communism did its best to stamp out religion entirely, to sort of like replace any religious need, they would have called it. Like that religion was a crux, and that was like counterproductive to the state functioning in its like fullest, most nationalistic form. So when you have the fall of the Soviet Union, what you're looking at after like post-1990s Russia and now like present-day China is this overlay of like spiritual nothingness on top of like what was traditionally like their spiritual heritage. So in Russia, before you had the Orthodox Church. During like the Soviet Union, you had this like attempt to wipe out all faith, and a lot of the underground church movement really spread. The same thing in China. You had all missionaries kicked out in 1950 with the Cultural Revolution. When we like got eyes back on China like 10, 15 years ago, like the number of Christians jumped from 750,000 to like 80 million. Largely because all the missionaries were kicked out, ironically. Because the church was allowed to flourish within its own like cultural way without the dependence and reliance on missionary help. It's actually quite fascinating. But so now in present day, in these areas where you do have this communist presence, you have this like overlay of like atheism on top of like old shamanism, on top of like semi-Buddhism. It's weird. Yeah. Cool. This sort of, I include this to say this is sort of what sets us up, okay, for where we are today in terms of where the gospel is, where it has been, and where it is not currently. Okay. And then we're going to move on from this image because it is so reductivist it can be a little confusing. But I want us to talk at our tables, go ahead and just discuss briefly why is the gospel where it is today? Just what did you find interesting or compelling or whatever? Just for a few minutes. Any super interesting thoughts worth sharing?
Like detrimental.
Anybody want to just sum up what they talked about or anything worth
That is a good one.
saying to the group? Yeah.
Just the way that it spread because of what you've seen, like God's plan, like the pillaging, colonialism, like God didn't need the motive to be about spreading His gospel for it to spread.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that is a good summary. If you look at like the history of the gospel, a lot of it wasn't intentional. A lot of it wasn't very pure. A lot of it wasn't very like, we're going to go and do this the right way. A lot of it was sort of incidental in that regard as to where we've gotten today. Yeah, please. No, please.
It would also, like, the idea of suffering. You just think about, like, the Viking example. Like, that sounds terrible for the women. And that's how they got the gospel. It puts that back into all talks about that.
Yeah, and I mean, this just came to mind. I didn't even share this with the others, but like that is happening a lot today. Maybe not on that level, but a lot of like your maids in Saudi Arabia are from places like East Africa or the Philippines that are Christian countries that are working in homes of very Muslim people. That is the reality today for a lot of people as well. This is the question that typically, the way this question typically gets asked, right? What is the role of the American Christian missionary? How can I as an American go and reach the need, right? And what this does is kind of set up America as the center, right? And the whole world as the ends of the earth, which I think from this image just we can see is just not true, right? You have this sort of whole ends of the earth. And so I think the much better question is this, and white area is the white on the map. Not the, I couldn't think of a better way to phrase it. What is the role of the Christ follower in the church in the Christianized area, right? This is a much better way to think of mission, right? No longer is it just America reaching the world, but it's the Christian areas reaching the unchristian areas, or joining God in the work of bringing about praise in the unchristianized areas. Does that make sense? Is that better? More fair? So that's where we're going to really take this. That's where really the missions as a whole is going as we move forward. Okay, so that brings us to the early mid-1900s, okay? You have this sort of legacy of first colonialisms in the coastland, then like this intentional push inland, and maybe a little bit more consideration of contextualization. And then you get the early mid-1900s, you have this guy named Cameron Townsend, who is at work in Guatemala, very Spanish-speaking country, and he hit these tribes who would confront him and say in their tribal dialects, like, if your God is so smart, why can't he speak our language? Or why are you expecting me to speak Spanish if your God is so great and if I should follow him? So he realized that even in very Christianized areas, there are these large linguistic pockets, right? And this is the guy, Cameron Townsend is the guy that went on to found Wycliffe, who is responsible for now attempting to translate the Bible into every known language, all 6,500 of them. And so that's kind of his legacy about 100 years ago. Then you have this guy, Donald McGavran, who was a missionary kid in India. By the time he got older, he realized that they would send the same number of resources to like 10 different missions. And the ones that were far and away the most successful were the ones that were done along similar ethnic bridges to similar ethnic groups. And so he realized that there's this connectivity that comes with shared ethnicity, with shared culture. And if you don't have it, there's this enormous barrier to the gospel. So these guys sort of come together, their ideas sort of get kind of brought into one, and you have this idea that first we need to pay attention to what ethnicity we're actually reaching, and then it's not just about a country, right? An Indian isn't an Indian, isn't an Indian. There are different ethnicities within. And then language as well. That language was this large barrier to the gospel. It didn't need to be necessarily. By the 1970s, you have these conventions in Switzerland, and this is where this idea really gained steam. 1974 was a big one led by Billy Graham, I believe, and then I think it was like 1976 or 78. The document is signed by all these people, and there's this consensus that the people group approach is going to be the way we're going to look at the mission moving forward as like a world evangelical body. It was like agreed upon that we're going to start looking not at countries, not at regions, but more at people groups in terms of how we're going to strategically engage in completing God's mission. To bring definition to that, these are the two big words, the ethnic and the linguistic, okay? A people group is one that is the largest ethno-linguistic group within which the gospel can spread as a church planting movement without encountering barriers of understanding or acceptance. It's a long, wordy definition, but this is the official definition that Joshua Project uses. Okay, basically think of it like this. It's a group of people that shares, one, an ethnicity, and thus a culture. Two, they share the same language. Within this people group, the gospel can spread easily, right? I can share the gospel with Daniel, and though he might not accept it, he can understand what I'm saying. There's not a barrier here. We're both fairly similar in terms of how we live, right? So he would understand what I'm saying. So the gospel can spread along this group without encountering barriers of understanding or acceptance. Understanding would be linked to language. And if you can't understand what I'm saying, you won't be able to really understand the gospel without some miracle. Or acceptance being like cultural or ethnic, right? If there is a sharp ethnic divide, if you have, if you have a Japanese person and a Chinese person who just ethnically hate each other, they're likely not going to listen to whatever gospel is being passed between them. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so when you have different groups of people like this, some barriers are things like language, dialect, culture, class. Socioeconomic class and caste are very big in places like India, where you have people of the same ethnicity and different castes who would never interact with each other. But it's actually more prevalent in America than probably we would even realize. Like, you're just not going to get a super white, fancy, rich woman from a Baptist church in Tennessee talking to a poor, grubby trucker or something like that, right? There just wouldn't be that shared culture. The gospel really doesn't transfer along those lines a lot.
Would it be plausible to consider the movement of gender identity and sexual orientation as the rise of a new people group in America?
Oh, I've never thought about that. What you're really getting into there, I would say no, because people group is defined by ethnicity and language. What you're getting there is beyond that. There's another word that I'm not going to touch on today called socio-peoples, which is really like your social distinctions. And that's where it actually gets into like truckers and rich white people and businessmen and whatever, like different aspects of society. And it's more of like an evangelistic sort of, how can you actually reach that group of people?
Yeah,
That's
because the word
fundamental.
acceptance is what triggered
Yes.
that thought.
Yeah, no, it's a good thought. But yeah, like for it to be a people group, there needs to be some sort of ethnic or language divide. Yeah.
Cool.
But to your point, though, some barriers are very small, right? If there is increasingly like people groups that we thought were one, where we're realizing, or people are realizing, there's actually a barrier between them, and maybe it's be more useful to think of them as two separate groups. So barriers can be very small, they can be very large, right? If a Japanese homeless man shows up at my door and starts jabbering at me, I'm not going to understand what he's saying. I'm not going to receive the message he's trying to communicate. The way for us to bridge the gospel from one people group to another is what? How would the gospel transfer from an American people group to a Japanese lower socioeconomic class people group? Okay, you have to overcome these barriers, right? Yeah, you have to take the gospel and present it in this culture and context, in their language, in their culture. That's basically missions work, right? There needs to be some intentional effort to bring the gospel across those barriers and build those bridges. Okay. Understanding people groups is important because it helps us understand how to relate to people. Basically, like, who are you? What are you? Where did you come from? Why are you the way that you are? Right? It can be a little reductivist, but it can be also this huge barrier if we don't do it properly. Right? We need to be able to understand who this people group is, what their resistance or barriers to the gospel will be because of their ethnicity, because of their culture, because of what they believe, because of their experience. That's super important in the gospel bridging into different people groups, transferring from one to another. This is the... yeah, go ahead, Reed.
This might be very simplistic question, or maybe it could be for a simple answer. Are there people groups like that are harder to bridge than others? Like Americans and X are a further bridge than Americans and Y.
So yes,
You know?
definitely. It would definitely depend on like the starting point of
Right.
the culture that you're referring to. So like the cultures and people groups most similar to American groups, English-speaking American groups would be like middle class-ish, Western-ish, often white-ish groups, or like even like neighboring countries maybe, although like Mexicans and Americans really aren't that similar of people groups, right? But those are going to be your like most natural connecting points, rather than like, you know, the Pygmy tribe in the Congo is going to be a very large point of departure. There's going to be a lot more work and intentionality in making that bridge, in lowering those barriers, for sure.
There's also not just those two, but it's also your appearance.
Mm-hmm.
So like at the Mexico base, we used to train up pastors that could better reach the Middle East because they fit in a little bit better.
Yeah. So we're going to spend the next like 4 weeks really talking about contextualization and how to lower those barriers and build those bridges. But yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, that is the same even for the States. Like, I would not walk into a Baptist church dressed the same way I would now, or talking the same way I would now. I would contextualize my message in the attempt to be better understood and received. It's the same sort of idea. We do this even on like an subconscious basis, right? If a friend is struggling with something like shame, I'm not going to start bashing them over the head with the Bible and telling them like the kingdom of God is near, right? I would maybe like gently soften my approach, right? I contextualize my message just in how I communicate with people. Same thing. The question that I get asked most these days is, how do I understand more about culture? How do I research culture? How do I understand people? To me, this is the biggest way to do that, is to bridge the question of how has a people group's history, where they've come from, contributed to their current religious or demographic makeup? Basically, especially like in regards to how rich they are. Basically, like, it's one thing to know that a culture like lives in mountains and is, you know, hikes up mountains and it does that. It's another thing to know that they do that, and that indicates that they're super probably isolated, that they've had their own kingdom, that they've been very untouched by other, you know, countries or cultures or whatever, right? If they're Buddhist as well, that adds another layer of understanding to what they might believe or how they might perceive my gospel, right? So it's one thing to know something about a culture, like they don't shake with their left hand. It's another thing to know why. What does that tell me about their richness? What might that tell me about a bridge to the gospel? Or how can I use that to understand who they are in terms of their current, in terms of where they are in relation to the kingdom, right? Are they far from the kingdom? How can I bring them into the kingdom? How can I lower those barriers and build those bridges to get them into the kingdom? And second, where are they in terms of God's meta-narrative? Are they a super reached people group that has a vibrant church, or maybe a failing church that needs lift and support? Do they need mobilizing into other unreached areas? Are they super unreached? Has these people never had access to the gospel? These are very different considerations of how I would approach ministry within a people group. And basically it comes down to this. This is the question that we're going to be landing on with participants over and over again, is when I look at somebody, I'm trying to assess what is the good news of the gospel for this person. That's the point of understanding a people group. It's the point of understanding who you are, historically who you are, personally who you are, and what about the good news is going to resonate as good news for you and not bad news for you. And again, we're going to get way into this, much, much, much deeper than today. And this brings us to this term, the very, very important term in terms of people groups, this aspect of reachedness. A people group's level of reachedness refers to that people group's access to the gospel much more than its adherence to the gospel. Basically, and I want to make this big distinction, we only use the term reached in terms of people groups. We don't use it with individuals or villages necessarily. We use terms like lost, unevangelized, or non-Christian. So it would just be grammatically, contextually inappropriate for me to say, my neighbor is unreached. I'm going to go share the gospel with them. Your neighbor is not unreached. They are in an American people group. They have access to the gospel. If they wanted to know who Jesus was, they could come ask you. They could go to a church on the corner. They could Google it. They could get a Bible. They have access to the gospel. They're not unreached. They might be lost. They might never have heard the gospel in a way that's going to connect to them, but those are different things. When we're talking about a people group that's unreached, we're talking about that people group does not have access to the Bible and maybe in their language. They don't have a church in their village. They don't have the ability to go and meet somebody on a daily occurrence who's going to be able to explain this to them. Essentially, if they were to have a dream of Jesus and he would visit them into a dream, they would be unable to find out what that meant. That's the difference, right, of unreached versus lost, right? It is important to reach our lost neighbors. It is also differently important to bring access to the gospel among people groups that are unreached. Is that distinction? To get super clinical with our definitions, these are also printed out on your table, so that's helpful to have it just in print in front of you rather than just listen to me. An unreached people group, by definition, is a group of people that share an ethnicity and language without a large enough self-propagating indigenous evangelical population of believers to adequately spread the gospel throughout the rest of that people group. And essentially, I have a people group, like a pool of people. If I put some believers in it, say I put some red dye in that people group. If there is not enough red dye, if that red dye is too small, it will not turn the rest of the pool red. Right? If there is enough, eventually that pool will become red. And notice with this language that it doesn't need to happen immediately. Right? The biggest indicator that missiologists have found to determine whether this can happen, whether the group of Christians in that people group can reach the rest of their population, is if the number of evangelical believers hits about 2%. Right? So if there's about 2%, and this is very mathematical, it's very concept-based, okay? But if that number of evangelicals hits about 2%, likely they will be able to spread the gospel throughout the rest of their people group without any outside help whatsoever. And they won't need missionaries or some outside help to help people understand the gospel within their lifetime. Typically, if this number is lower than 2%, people within that people group will not often hear the gospel within their lifetime unless that number increases. Does that make sense? So it's just about this. It's about this number of evangelicals being below 2%. What this means is that a people group doesn't have access to the gospel. They won't be able to hear it even if they wanted to. And that there's very little or no Christian presence among them. And that's what an unreached people group means. On the contrary, on the flip side of that, is a reached people group. It's a group with all those things, with a large enough self-propagating indigenous evangelical population that can adequately spread the gospel throughout the people group without outside help. It's typically and almost always accompanied by a vibrant church presence and access to Christian materials. All right, and this is the big difference between, a Christian living in America and a reached people group is that I can go and listen to 1,000 different podcasts, 1,000 different sermons, look at any commentary I want, call up a church, find a pastor, call my aunt, whatever, right? I have access to the gospel. I have access to the Bible. Somebody living in a Bengali community doesn't have that ability. Maybe the Bible only exists in the New Testament form. Maybe you can't buy it in any store in your city. Maybe there is no church. Your family or your entire village or town or even city of millions of people has no tradition or history of Christianity. That's the difference here. So with reached people groups, they become more or less considered reached. Okay? Again, this is a construct. I don't know if I made that distinction enough. This is a construct. The Bible doesn't literally say, go and reach each ethno-linguistic people group that is defined this way, and when you do exactly that, the end will come. It doesn't say that. This is our best attempt to understand where there are big holes, or where there are any holes in terms of people's ability to hear the gospel. So a big thing with Reach is that they have access, they could if they wanted to, and there is a Christian presence, right? They could find people to talk to. You have this big group in the middle. It's not actually a big group, but the group in the middle would be a minimally reached or a falsely reached people group. It's when you have a group with a small indigenous number of evangelicals, so less than 2%, but the group has a culture or a tradition of Christianity and often access to Christian materials. Okay? There's a great way to think of this is like Europe. It's when your professing number of Christians gets higher than 50%, where like maybe like everybody in Italy 50 years ago was Catholic. Everybody, right? And like now, if you're Italian, your grandma's Catholic, but you would never really step foot in a church. You don't know any evangelical communities. None of your friends like follow Jesus. That's the reality of a minimally reached or falsely reached people group. Falsely reached is this number when this number gets higher than 50%, when the culture is so Christian, like Armenia or Georgia or a lot of like countries in Latin America. Everybody's a Christian, but the number of evangelical Jesus-following people isn't as high as that would make it seem.
You're saying 50, it says 5. Is that a typo?
No, when it becomes a yellow group, or it becomes an orange group, when it hits 5, it becomes yellow when it hits 50. Yeah. So that would be your falsely reached groups, or when they're like, when this number hits 50, it's like everybody's a Christian. There's this culture of Christianity, but your number of evangelicals is still low. A lot of Eastern Europe is like this. Any questions on that? I know it gets very technical, but this is the mathematical tool to help us understand the task remaining. You have this big scary black word. The unengaged, unreached people group, or UUPG, is a group without any active church planning strategy, no missionary presence, and no gospel workers whatsoever. So by definition, there is nothing currently being done to reach this people group with the gospel. There is 0% evangelicals, 0% professing, no access, no presence, no work currently. The number of people in unengaged people groups has dropped dramatically in just the last 2 years, as there's been like a super big emphasis on like churches engaging to reach UUPGs. I think I just checked the current number. I had to update the number from there. It used to be like 3. What does it say on the back? What does it say?
310.
310 groups and 32 million people. I think it used to be like 4 times that, just like a couple years ago. So 32 million people in our 7.6 billion currently living without any sort of work being done to bring the gospel to them. A lot of the groups that were just recently adopted by churches or by communities still don't have anything going on, but there's like the hope that it will. Right? So a lot of these that if they were unengaged 5 years ago, there's still probably not a lot being done within these communities. When you look at the total of the world, you get the breakdown by this, and this might actually be surprising, but 3 billion people live in an unreached people group. It's more than 40% of the world. Right? And you would think in 2019 that it wouldn't be that hard for somebody living in even, say, Iraq or Lebanon or what have you to hear the gospel, but just the way that like interactions work, social interactions work, it just doesn't happen. So 3 billion people living in unreached people group, that's over 40%. Almost 50% of the world that lives in reached people groups, about 3.5 billion. And then you have like 765 in the middle, 10% of the world living in minimally reached groups. The difference, if you just make it as like concise as possible, a person in a reached group might know the gospel, but they definitely can know, right? Your aunt, she might know the gospel. She's heard of Jesus. You've fought with her over Jesus at Thanksgiving, right? And she can definitely know if she wants, right? She can go and ask anybody. But she might not necessarily believe it, right? A minimally reached group, somebody in a minimally reached group probably doesn't know the gospel. They're probably not Christian, but they could know, right? They could know. There is plenty of French gospel material available to them. Most of France would say they're not Christian, not following Jesus, but they could definitely know if they wanted to. Somebody in an unreached group can't know and probably won't know unless something changes. Unless something changes within like how many missionaries or whatever access they have, they probably won't know the gospel. When you break it up into a pie chart, it looks very neat like this. You kind of get the 40, 40, and 10. Well, 42, 45, and 10 or so. This accounts for every person on the planet. Every person on the planet is broken up into one of these people groups, and in all, there are about 17,000 of them. This number does continue to increase, not because we're discovering new people groups, but because we're figuring out that maybe there are more distinctions than we originally thought. So I'm constantly updating these numbers. It's super obnoxious, but I can't even say this.
Put an as of on there.
Yeah, does that make sense? So 17,000 people groups. There's about 200 actual countries in the world. So just think of that in terms of how important it is to think of somebody not just by their national identity, but by what we would consider their people group identity as well. Yeah.
Where are the UUPGs mostly?
Who?
I mean,
That's a good question.
Are there specific locations? I mean, India, I think.
They would be super small, obscure, minority groups tucked away in far corners of countries where that already have little gospel witness. So you're talking little groups in India where there are so many people groups. I'm sure a lot of them are unengaged. Little, just tiny, maybe there a lot of places in southern China have a lot of ethnic diversity. I would imagine maybe some of those qualify. I don't actually know though. That's a good question. But it'd be somewhere where nobody's going, period.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody's going to Niger, period. And then you take a small tribe within that's remote and far away, those would be your UPGs probably.
Cool.
Yeah. If you plot every people group on a map, you get a map like this. Something to really keep in mind right from the front is that each people group is represented by only one dot. It doesn't reflect the size of that people group.
Right.
So some people groups with 100 million people is represented by one dot. One with 50 people is also represented by one dot. Okay? The red ones are the unreached, the green are the reached, your yellow are the falsely reached, and orange are the minimally reached. The white spaces are places with low population density. So there's just not a lot of people there. Each dot represents one people group, and they're kind of set at the geographical center of where that people group is, more or less. Anything that stands out to you about this map if I present it like this?
Do you know the ones in the U.S.?
India is so dense. Yeah, what'd you say?
Do you know the ones in? I'm surprised. How
I
many
do.
red are in the
I'll
US.
actually talk about them, but yeah, it might be surprising, but there are unreached people groups in the U.S. I'll talk about it in a minute, though. Yeah. What did you guys say?
That was what we were
I was going to say. Yeah. But it more or less reflects the earlier political map, the white and green and red, right? With the definite, these being the two major differences. Yeah. Quite a large difference. When we look at the Western Hemisphere, okay, the U.S. itself has 849 people groups. 85 of those are considered unreached. All of those are immigrant communities. You might have thought they were maybe Native American groups or not. They're not. Any indigenous group in the U.S. has access to the gospel. A lot of those are Bengalis or Turks or something that have moved within the last 50 years or so and created a Somalian community in Minnesota that's centered around Minneapolis would be one of those dots. Okay. Latin America has 41 UPGs left that are indigenous out of the 1,300 people groups that are there. And they all lie inside the Amazon basin except for one. There's only one indigenous unreached people group left in North America, and it's in Mexico. And they're even 1% Christian now. But the task remaining in terms of unreachedness in the Western Hemisphere is almost gone. Right? This wasn't the case even 20 years ago. There were a lot more, but a lot of work has been done in the West. All the groups that are unreached in these countries like Brazil or Peru, they live way deep in the Amazon jungle. They're super small tribes usually, and they're very protected by the government. But actually, there are efforts being made to reach them. There are missions and organizations that are beginning to get access in very healthy ways to reach them in sustainable ways. It's not going to wipe them out. And Kate said yesterday that the ministry within Brazil that was in charge of protecting those unreached tribes, actually the job was somebody got the job recently. Was a YWAM guy who is now creating bridges to go and bring access to the gospel to those communities. So your dream, the dream of going and reaching the last Amazonian tribes, it's almost gone, right? It doesn't exist anymore. They all have the gospel, which is great. Okay, but then the focus becomes different, right? We're not going to bring the gospel there; it's already there. In relation to God's meta narrative, the goal in the Western Hemisphere is now partnership, combating nominalism or syncretism, right, or the falling away of true gospel practice, strengthening the church. Access to resources, this is a big one, right? Again, we have, I can go and listen to 1,000 podcasts in a minute about Christianity in English, less so in other languages. Obviously, there's a lot in Spanish, but you have a lot of other languages down there as well. And then mobilization and sending, this becomes the big focus, right? Not reaching Brazilians, but sending Brazilians. Not reaching Guatemalans, but sending Guatemalans. Okay. This becomes the focus, and this should be the focus of our teams when we go. We're not going to reach people that would be doing a job that doesn't need being done necessarily, right? We're going to strengthen what is there and reshift our focus. Okay. Examples of major reach people groups. This is the most American picture I could find. So, that's us. The U.S. American group is 170 million people large. It accounts for most second-generation people in America. It's mostly white, but not primarily, not only white. Usually once somebody hits second or third generation, they would join this group. But it gets really dicey in terms of ethnicity in America, because obviously this is a melting pot. We're listed at 33% evangelical. Evangelical, I should state, refers to the heart change, but this number is obviously impossible to actually account for. I can't tell if somebody's had a heart change or not. I can't tell if somebody's a Jesus follower or not. What it does is they project this number from church membership data from churches with evangelical doctrines. So if you're a member of an evangelical church, or your family is, largely you're included in this percentage number, or there's some projection that includes you in this percentage number. But this number probably then is skewed high, right? Because that number would probably be higher than what is actually Jesus following people in America. Okay. This is the largest people group in the world, the Han Chinese, 855 million people in China. 855 million people in China. They all speak Mandarin. They're now 8.3% evangelical. This wasn't the case even a year or two ago. I had to update that number just even from the last time I gave this presentation. I think it was in the 6s. That wasn't the case. They were unreached, I think, as early as 10, 15 years ago, right? So the church, we kind of maybe have heard this, is exploding in China, right? This does not mean that every Han Chinese person has heard the gospel. This means that 8.3% of them now adhere to evangelical Christianity, and they are large enough to reach the rest of their group without outside assistance, right? So you still have an issue in China with people never having heard the gospel, but right now they are much more likely to be able to hear it from a Chinese person within their lifetime than they were before, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay. And let's still keep into account, though, that 855 million people is 2/3 of the 1.3 billion that live in China, right? So while it is the largest people group in the world, this is me thinking of only 2/3 of the Chinese population, right? This is why people groups is important, because I can't just say a Chinese person will necessarily be in this group, right? There's a distinction even within countries. Other examples, just a couple examples of major UPGs. This is the largest unreached people group on the left, the Sheikhs in Bangladesh. There's another 80 million across the border in India. They speak Bengali and they're 0.00% evangelical. They think there's a few thousand believers among them, but the numbers are so low that most sheikhs in Bangladesh and India will die without hearing the gospel. And there's been a lot of work traditionally among them. Even William Carey, who's the most famous Indian missionary 200 years ago, he was working among the sheikhs back in the time. They think that they're on the brink of a big gospel movement, but it hasn't happened yet. Then the Hausa in Nigeria, they're kind of an interesting example. I included them because this number is very close to 2%. Actually higher than I thought it was. But they actually experience a ton of persecution. Within Nigeria, you have the competition against the Muslim and Christian groups that causes a lot of persecution. So despite maybe the 1.9% evangelical number here, you're actually going to get more persecution here than you would necessarily over there. Interesting. These are major groups, just two examples of groups we do with. We sent our first expedition team to Uzbekistan just not too long ago, a month or two ago. 25 million people, they speak Uzbek. Uzbekistan has just recently opened up its borders. They've changed its visa policy to a visa, electronic visa on arrival. Whereas before, it was much more difficult to get a visa. So that you're going to see, hopefully, ideally, sort of the gospel start taking off in a way in Uzbekistan that it has been over the last 20 years in places like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, who have had more liberal visa policies. And then the Thais, this is the Thai Central group. There's like a Northern Thai group as well that we work with. Still under 1% evangelical, about 0.25% evangelical. Okay. Just minor groups. Again, like UPGs can be small or big. This is a group of 30 people. They live in Western China. They were the remnant of a military arm that was sent there 300 years ago and just left there. They speak a language you've never heard of, and there are 0 believers among them. They're very quickly becoming assimilated into the majority Chinese groups. So within who knows how many years, at least one generation, right? This as a unique cultural identity will likely disappear. Again, people group is a construct to help us understand the barriers of the gospel. It's not necessarily, Jesus didn't say, go and reach these exactly 17,073 people groups with the gospel. No. This is a group in the Amazon jungle in Peru, 200 people. They think their profile on Joshua Project reads that likely a few people have heard of who Jesus is, but there are no known believers among them. That's the differences. So I want us to think about, critically and collectively, what does the people group approach do well? How does this help us identify tasks and where we should prioritize our focus? Go ahead and talk at your tables about it first. Let's do that. All right. So any thoughts? What does the people group approach do well? How does this help us? What did you guys talk about?
Well, one thing that we were kind of saying is it gives you a more realistic perspective of what work you can actually do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it helps us sort of analyze the task really. What's going to be work that needs doing and what isn't? Yeah.
Better understanding, you mean target more?
Yeah, it helps identify people as groups. It allows us to target or think strategically about what we're doing, and it really, I think, identifies barriers really well. Right? Anything else?
You know how to contextualize
What'd you say?
correctly. Help you know how to contextualize correctly.
Yeah, good. And so, on the surface, it doesn't, right? It doesn't tell me anything about how to actually bring the gospel to that people group. But if I do my research and I understand my people group well, it can help me a lot with contextualizing my message. Yeah, all good things. Here's what I wrote, just that it allows us to identify barriers. It helps us track where there's gospel presence or where there's gospel access. And it helps us look at the task of strategy from a macro level. Right? It helps us look where is the work that still needs to be done. Okay, and then what does the people group approach not do well? What are the limitations of it? Does anything come to mind?
We kind of said one of it doesn't actually tell you how to contextualize.
Yeah, right. It doesn't actually tell me how to do the contextualization. Yeah. Good try.
To know them better.
Yeah.
You can now speak in tongues.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else?
Maybe you could forget about a group if they're not reached or something.
Okay.
Or if they're not reached.
Yeah, it can help maybe look at it a large picture, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually going to meet the needs strategically, right? There might be people groups that get lost or whatever, what have you.
I don't think it necessarily helps Westerners be if our influence is less. So actually that might be a good thing. But if you're thinking about it from our seats.
Because it kind of identifies the gap in cultural difference? Is that what you're saying?
Someone actually probably could do that a lot better than we could. So I think that's a positive and a negative.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I wrote some down as well. It doesn't exactly identify place, right? Which is actually really positive, right? In some ways, a Bengali in America is very different than a Bengali over there. So that separation of place is helpful. But then on one hand, it doesn't really tell me where that group is. Actually, to find out where sheikhs are is very difficult, even with the data that is there. It doesn't really exactly tell me their religion on first glance. It doesn't tell me the size of the people group, right? So just looking at that map, the lack of size in that data is not super helpful. It doesn't tell me the trajectory, is it 1.9 and growing, or is it 1.9 and shrinking, right? Those are different. I would approach that group differently. It doesn't take into account globalization or people groups joining or second generation immigrants or languages changing. It doesn't do that very well. And it doesn't give us a strategy of engagement. How do I actually contextualize this to people? I have to do a little bit more research. And so all in all, right, like there's this balance that needs to be done when we look at the task in this way. There's a difference between lostness, my neighbor is lost, and the lack of access. Somebody in Afghanistan will die without hearing the gospel. There's a difference between a focus, not a bad thing, but there's a difference between strengthening the existing church, building up what is there in America, that's very important, or expanding the church into places that it isn't, right? Those are just different. And there's a difference between purposeful work, right? Having a community center and engaging in holistic community transformation, super purposeful, right? Or meta-narrative work, bringing people groups that don't have access to the gospel into the kingdom. Right? Those are just different focuses, and the key to all this is keeping the end goal in mind. Right? The goal is everybody, every people, tribe, and tongue represented around the throne. Right? As hard as it may be to hear, the Bible doesn't say anything about all Americans needing to know the gospel or believe the gospel. Right? It says every diversity needs to have access to the gospel. Okay, this brings us to the task remaining, which is really the best way to think about our place as people in the meta-narrative before the and then of Matthew 24, right? How much task is there before the and then the end will come? Okay? The missionary task, I talked about the missionary focus before, to join God in what he's doing. But the missionary task is a little bit more, what's the word? Incisive, maybe? It's to bring about the beginning of a gospel movement in every people, so that the people of that given culture will become saturated with the gospel eventually, okay? Right? It's to put the seeds of the gospel in a people group so that it will become large enough that it can then continue reaching, right? The goal isn't to reach every single person of that people group with the gospel as a missionary. They are much better reached by somebody that is expressing the gospel, following the gospel in their own language, culture, and customs. Right? So this kind of like takes it away from me to reach everybody, right? To establish a gospel movement that then it can continue without the missionary there. Right? Good. If we look at where we're at in terms of the task remaining, we can look at like where the majority of the need is. And I've highlighted it. You guys obviously know what this the box is. It's the 1040 window, which is called that because the latitude lines. Yeah, you have the 10 degrees north latitude line here and the 40 degrees north latitude line there. It contains the majority of people that live in unreached. It contains the majority of unreached people groups and the majority of people in unreached people groups, both by population and group number. The definition is kind of shifted. 5 years ago, there was a change. It used to be that any country that literally lied within these boundaries was considered part of the 1040 window. It contained like 85% of the total. It's now been changed to any country in or near the 1040 window that has a significant percentage of UPGs in it is now part of the 1040 window. So now your Indonesia, which is actually outside of the 1040 window, is considered part of the 1040 window, whereas your Philippines, which is 90% Christian adherent, is not considered part of the 1040 window despite actually being in it. Just a change of definition to sort of encompass better the task remaining. And what that does is it brings us, I'm jumping ahead. It brings us to a place, I am jumping ahead. Okay, that makes sense? Okay. What is the inherent contradiction, therefore, between STM trips and UPGs?
You need long-term presence there?
Okay, good. Yeah. An unreached group with no access, no presence, needs long-term presence almost necessarily to become reached. Sure. What else?
Being a partner with local people who actually understand the culture.
Good. STM almost entirely depends on having a receiving presence, having an established church body, right? And if you're going to a church area that's viable enough to host an STM trip team, likely they're in a reached country. What else?
It's far.
Yeah, especially from our seat over here. Well, you have if you're sending people for a week, right? You're not going to be sending them to here and then taking a bus to here and then walking to here, right? You're just not going to be able to do it. Not with a group of 18-year-olds, right? Good. Yeah, good. So there's this need for partnership. There's a value for project, right? They want results. The church in America wants results. If you haven't painted something like, what was the video? Like, let's remember the real goal, to take photos of minority children. So, use them as our Facebook picture. Right, access, right? If it's a receptive country, like often short-term trips will go to places where it is more safe, where you can get a visa, right? Where you're not going to have to worry about security as much.
Yeah.
And the value for continued relationship beyond often indicates that it's just almost always easier, it is easier to send an STM trip to a reached country or a reached people group rather than an unreached people group. All right. This is a map of the new 1040 window, or the revised version that I was talking about, that includes countries outside the boundaries. An accurate map doesn't exist. You can try Googling one, but there's inconsistencies in all of them. It's very frustrating that in 2019 you can't get an accurate picture on the internet of what it should. But often they'll include Sudan as one country instead of breaking up South Sudan. Or they'll include the Philippines or forget to include whatever country. So this is a map that I've literally made. It's the only map I can find of the real 1040 window. Feel free to use it. Yeah.
When you say the decision was made to then include people outside the 1040 window, who is they that makes the decision?
I don't know exactly if I know. It's leading missiologists. So Joshua Project, and there's another one too. Gordon Conwell has a big, keeps track of a lot of this stuff as well.
Okay.
People in those spheres have rewritten the definition to include a group of countries that sort of better reflects the need.
Okay. And that's where you draw a lot of
Yes.
your data from.
Correct, yes.
Cool.
I get most of my data from Joshua Project, yes. So the reason this is important as a construct is because the 1040 window those countries contain 97% of the population of all UPGs, about 3 billion people. So if you're in an unreached people group, there's a 97% chance that you're living in one of those countries. Okay? It then only contains about 3.3% of the missionary force. So only 10,000 of our 400 and whatever 20,000 missionaries are in those countries reaching unreached people groups. There's actually 3 times that. There's about 30,000 missionaries that are in those countries, but only a third of them are actually focusing on unreached people groups. This is where I get the 3.3% number. 95% of the people within the 1040 window are unevangelized, right? They haven't been told the gospel in a way they can understand. Right, we tell our expedition participants who are in countries in the 1040 window, there is a very good chance statistically that you will be the only opportunity the person in front of you has of hearing the gospel. Right? There's a good chance that you're it. Right? It's crazy.
And is that 3.3% from the U.S. churches?
Global.
Global.
Yep.
Danny, is there any data on why that's the case? Why the lack of presence in the 1040 window?
Mission presence. We're going to get to that. I'll actually kind of include as a discussion. But yeah. When we look at the task remaining, there are still 1,700 languages left without a single verse of translation. Wycliffe is hoping to change this. They're actually hoping to start projects in each language by the year 2025. So it's happening fast. They've redone the strategy of how they translate the Bible. No longer are they sending somebody to a village for 20 years to learn the language and develop a script and whatever. They actually can have these conferences of people that speak multiple middle languages. And they actually are very volunteer run. You can go on a 2-week trip to Bamako, capital of Mali, and translate the Bible into a super obscure language. They are doing New Testament translations in 2 weeks. And the volunteers don't even need to be super trained if you're decently educated or can facilitate conversations of meaning of words. It's great for parents. Great for parents who have money and disposable income and time. Right? Wycliffe needs people, needs volunteers, and they are hoping to have Bibles translated by 2025, or beginnings of translations by 2025. If you look at it, the numbers numerically, there are about 1,000 churches that exist in the world for every UPG. Right? That is to say that if 1,000 churches got together and we all just picked one, right, and every church did that, we would be able to reach we would be able to focus on every unreached people group in the world. Okay? 1% of money given to missions in general, missions being soup kitchens and refab work in our backyard, and also missions, right? 1% of money given to missions in general goes to reaching UPGs in the 1040 window. Right? So why this is so crazy is you have 97% of the task and 1% of the money. 97% of the task and 3% of the workers. Right? It's the equivalent of saying, let's clean this whole room. I'm going to invite 100 people in, and they're going to focus on the top of the table in the back. That's all they're going to clean, right? They're going to clean it and clean it. They're going to leave for a week and come back and clean it again because there's a little bit of dust on it. That's the equivalence of what we're talking about, right? It's the lack of focus on the whole. So much so that they've forgotten that the goal was to clean the whole room. Right? If it's clean, great. Could it be cleaner? Yes. Right? But what was the goal? It was to clean the whole room. It's the equivalent of seeing like 97% of people carrying a log on one end and 3 on the other, and then sending the 101st person to go help the 97. Right, that's essentially what we're doing over and over again. When you have this is called the great imbalance, right? 3% of the work going, 97% of the need receiving, what am I saying? 97% of the work we're doing happening among the 3% of the need, 3% of the work we're doing happening among the 97% of the need. When you have this imbalance, right, at current progress levels, the task remaining gets larger, not easier, right? People are literally having babies faster than we're sending missionaries to reach them, right? Randomized missionary placements would accomplish the task faster than what we're currently doing, right? If we're sending 97% of our resources, people-wise, and 1% of our money to the actual job that needs to be done, 64 countries in the 1040 window. It's a third of all countries, right? And we're only sending 3% of our workforce there. It's the equivalent of me. I mean, like literally, if I were to draw a map on the ground and like tell my 1-year-old son, like, here, assign missionaries, go for it, buddy, he'd do a better job than we're currently doing at reaching the unreached. Okay? Closure. The goal is closure. That doesn't mean reaching every person, but it means breakthrough in every people group. That's in conjunction with that missionary task slide that we need to start. We can start the gospel movement, and then it can continue from there. Okay, the factors preventing this from happening are clearly not. They're clearly not money, right? If we're only sending 1% of our money, or it's literally 1/1,000,000th of Christian income. Tithe is 10%. We're sending 1/1,000,000th of our Christian income to the unreached people groups, to the task remaining. Hey, it's not the number of Christians. There's 1,000 churches for every UPG. It's not resource related at all. So what is it? What is preventing the church as a whole from reaching closure? Comfort, yeah. Fear, sure.
There's a lot of risk in the regions.
There is a lot of risk. There's also a lot of perceived risk. Yeah, totally. And they're not the same. Yeah.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Lack of knowledge or knowing?
Totally, right? If we could remind people that the goal was to clean the whole room and not just the top of that table, right? Some people would probably listen or do it or reevaluate what they're doing. Yeah. Knowledge is also important. I mean, like, how many of you, obviously, this is not going to work in this room, but we all know people who've been to Guatemala. For a lot of us, it was our first country, right? I've heard of SCM trips going to Guatemala. I've seen the fruit that comes there. I've heard, long-term workers have come and visited my church. I've been there. It was great. I want to go back there. I'm going to go back and be a long-term missionary in Guatemala. Conversely, how many people have heard of Mauritania? How many people have heard of a missionary from Mauritania, right? There's this aspect of a mission building on its own success, right? I'm more likely to go to a place or justify going to a place that I'm familiar with, that I've heard of, that I can see the fruit. Yeah, what else?
A lot of it to me is commitment to the process of preparation. The extent of training to be able to contextualize, to have some kind of a skill or value add to the culture or the society that helps people in entry. And just the concept of this is my life, not this is my 11 months.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it'd be much easier for me to move my family to Guatemala. I'd have to do much less preparation than it would be for us to relocate to Afghanistan. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? All very valid, all very true, right? Strength building on strength, ignorance, fear, what have you, right? This has prevented us as a church from seeing the goal clearly and then reacting appropriately to bring about closure. Okay, and I want to look at our programs, what we do sort of within this context of the task remaining and the meta-narrative. This isn't meant to be an indictment by any means, but just the reality of where we're at today. Okay, I'm going to throw this map that isn't very helpful back up on the board, just for reference. Right, this is, again, the political presence of Christianity currently. If you plot all of our engagements by our relative frequency on a map, you get a map like this. 5 bright spots immediately to me would be these 5 big green dots. India, Nepal, I believe it's Thailand, Cambodia, and Malaysia with, I think Vietnam is the lighter green one. right? These are great, right? Like we're doing things in these areas. The caveat with that would be that just because we are having ministry placements in these areas doesn't mean that our ministries are focused on actually reaching unreached people. A lot of these placements are project-based. A lot of them are painting a wall, what have you, right? So just because we're there doesn't mean we're actually working towards the task at hand. If you plot the two maps on top of each other, you get this, and you can see sort of just, I mean, it is the same thing we said with STMs. The reality of an STM trip is most of it's going to be where the church is. Okay? Here's a list of countries that we go to currently or have visited in the past that contain a significant percentage of unreached people groups. The ones that I've highlighted in orange are in the 1040 window technically, and the ones outside of are not. So I mean, we actually do go to quite a few places. I mean, I think there's well over 25 on this list. I haven't counted them. But yeah, any questions about this? Somebody yesterday asked what it means for Morocco to be 100% UPGs. That means that if you're in Morocco, you're in, or almost certainly in an unreached people group. The Moroccan Arab group is like it's a very homogenous country, so it's or decently homogenous. It's like the Moroccan Arab group is unreached. If you're Moroccan Arab in Morocco, you are unreached. There are small pockets of people that aren't unreached people, like for instance, like British people. Say there's 10,000 British people in Morocco. They're a reached people group, but within the 40 million, they don't really make a dent in that percent. That's what that means.
So, can I add
Yeah.
something? I know that, like we talked about SCM, I'm obviously in that space more, but when you consider that the race, it's a month in those places, so for all purposes, it's also kind of short term. Do you think, is there a defined length of time that's actually effective? Like, because I mean, 3 weeks over 1 week, yes, you're there longer, more established relationship. Just, I don't know.
I mean, I guess it depends on to what end. If you're talking about being like a successful partner, right? You run the issue too of a lot of partners, or being a successful guest to a partner. A lot of partners don't really love taking teams for more than a month, more than 3 months. It becomes a burden. What am I going to do with this team? It's like having a house guest for 3 months at that point, right? So I mean, I don't know if there's a good answer to that question. It would depend on the context and what the goal of that team is. Obviously, we all know that there is not no fruit in going. Obviously, like the Lord can move and conversations can happen, and that does happen regularly, and that's sort of an underpinning value of SCM trips in some ways is the flash in the pan intensity, the passion, like the fire that a lot of trips carry. Like a lot happens in a short amount of time that wouldn't necessarily happen at that same rate in a longer duration. But what is often needed, obviously, is long-term investment, contextualized ministry, that sort of a thing.
Yeah. I just think it's funny that we just like separate them out when I do think
They're pretty similar.
I would say my world race was 11 short-term trips, just all in a row.
Most long-term missions isn't considered long-term by most people until you're at least 2 years. If it's a 2-year trip, it's not even considered a long-term by some definitions.
And this is also, when you saying SCM, you're not talking about like department? Because
Yes.
I'm hearing this as in world races and that too, like, that's just like in general.
Yeah, I mean, right. Like, so I would include the World Race. I would agree with you that I would, in this context, consider World Race 11 STM trips rather than one intentional long-term trip. Yep.
I think my answer to your question of how long you have to be there to be effective is how are you connected to what the long-term plan of the host ministry is. So, I mean, if I'm fixing my car and I gotta get to a certain part of the engine, but I have to take out a screw first, I really need a Phillips screwdriver, but I only need it for about 3 minutes. But if I don't have that, I can't do what I'm trying to do. So you might be the 3-minute Phillips screwdriver. A specialized thing that actually fits what the ministry needs done to fit into their, longer term plan, which is kind of why we're trying to get to the whole concept of working with strategic partners who have a ministry development plan so that our teams make sense. So that we're actually bringing them the tool they need when they need it that can do what they need it to do.
I didn't mean to like.
No, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. If you look at it locationally, I think this is a better map than the one I just showed in terms of frequency and engagement. The green dots are where any route, traditional route, has gone or will go. The red dots are currently where expedition only is gone. But some of the green dots started out as traditional, and then sort of been repurposed more towards expedition. Some of the green dots have started out as expedition and then become sort of normalized across routes. So it's gone both ways. But it actually is a more robust map than maybe that first map shows. So. Here it is if you break down the countries that have a less than 2% evangelical population. And what you'll see here is a lot of Eastern European countries start jumping on this list, where you have a low evangelical number but a high tradition of Christianity. And then again, there's almost 30, I think there's like 30 countries up on this list. If we're looking forward to where we're going in terms of like actually designing routes, we're looking at like designing routes with the express purpose of developing this progression towards higher level ministry needs and actually creating a framework by which a participant can better understand the value of work in a reached country or a context and an unreached country or context. All right, so then this idea of sort of progressing as maybe the need of the ministry progresses is something that we're considering. If we move beyond the people group approach, right, we're already kind of, a lot of these are actually like already happening. There are already legitimate concerns of how we as a world, a Christian world, should be considering how we're approaching the mission. Okay, globalization and urbanization are huge considerations. I didn't check this. I think we just recently passed the threshold where like 50% of the world now lives in cities. And I think in the next 30 years it's going to jump to like 70%. Right? Urbanization is happening at a ridiculous rate. And with that, globalization is happening too, where people aren't speaking their tribal language anymore. Their kids aren't learning it, right? They're speaking major trade languages. But then you have this issue as well, where you have very multi-ethnic, very diverse cities, where there are whole pockets and neighborhoods that have super separate linguistic, even identities. And you have people that are speaking multiple languages as a regular thing, right? So the people group approach kind of falls apart in this regard. When you're approaching like a singular people group, right, with one language, but that person that you're doing ministry to speaks multiple languages, how does that church exist when that person or that community is speaking multiple languages?
Yeah, it makes me think about churches in inner cities that have like a specific multi-ethnic approach to their ministry.
Yeah, and that's going to be becoming the norm, I think, or at least much more of a need, even in like larger unreached cities, like Mumbai, right? Lots of Indian dialects spoken in Mumbai. Erbil in Iraq. I was in Iraq recently. Like half of them are speaking Arabic, half of them speak Kurdish. A lot of them speak like some combination of both. Right? How do you reach that city specifically? Okay. There's this issue now that's becoming more and more of an issue of oversaturation and systematic dependence. And unfortunately, STM can often create this when you have just this repeated sending to the same spots. There starts to breed the system of dependence on those structures. This is happening a lot in like sub-Saharan Africa. There was a host that visited just the other day that was living in Kenya and had just recently moved his family to Nepal for this very reason, right? That they were seeing this issue of their presence there was making the local church depend on them. The church was expecting money from them, expecting them to build them things, and it was becoming unhealthy. Okay? There's a balance of place in people that the people group approach kind of misses in a sense. Right? It's one thing to like have a church among a people group in a city. It's a different thing to reach that entire city, right, with the gospel. Okay, and then this sort of thing is like the future. This indigenous or neighboring missionary movements. Yeah, the indigenous or neighboring missionary movements. And this, we kind of touched on this with the initial map, right? But the idea where it's not just Americans reaching the world, right, but the reached world reaching the unreached world. Where you have much more and more happening now, like with ICM, nationalist movements of Indians reaching neighboring unreached villages, right? People from one recently reached people group, then reaching their neighboring unreached people groups. This is more and more the future. And so the balance of reaching and mobilizing becomes a really big deal. I talked briefly about how mission sort of has gone through three eras, the coastlands, and the inlands, and then the people group approach. Some people are arguing for like a fourth era of mission, although it's not a unified consensus, that the approach should be more of from the ends of the earth to the ends of the earth. Right? How are we mobilizing that recently reached people group rather than continuing to go and treat them like an unreached people group? Okay, the importance of Indians reaching the rest of India rather than just American missionaries or Western missionaries reaching the rest of India. This is super interesting. And quite compelling, I think. Joshua Project estimates that the long-term workers needed to bring about closure for all unreached people groups is 66,000 people, which is not that many. We have 6,000 alumni world racers alone, which, if they were all mobilized long-term, would account for 10% of the global task remaining. Just this organization. And if you add gap year, if you add whatever programs on top of that, that number starts ballooning. I think we I remember it being a thing in 2012 when I was on the field, that like AIM had sent its 100,000th person. Right? 100,000 people is larger than the amount of missionaries needed. Right? That's the scope of like the potential we have for impact, I think. So I think the way forward is asking some really hard questions. Okay? How are our participants being equipped to properly frame their experiences within the context of the task remaining? Right? How is what they saw and what they did for a year, how is that relevant to them living the rest of their lives as a Christ-following missional Christian in regards to the task at hand? What still needs being done? Okay? How are our participants being properly equipped to engage or mobilize among vastly different people groups long term? Okay? If you're coming back from the race and living in America, how are you being equipped to mobilize, cast vision for this task? How are you being equipped to mobilize the church towards this task remaining? If you're coming back from the race or from any of our programs and moving long term, how are you equipped to be able to work among that people group specifically? And then what does creating a value for global reachness and mass mobilization among our participants look like? What would that look like for us as an organization to create this value of people understanding their place in the task remaining? So I want to leave us with this at our tables, this question: how can our programs best be designed, or whatever role you have in Adventures, how can our role and our programs best be designed to prepare participants for lifelong engagement with the reality of both the era of mission, right, the people group approach and the ends of the earth to the ends of the earth, and then the task remaining, what still needs to be done. So, thank you guys, appreciate it. Go ahead and just discuss this at your table, and that's all I have for you. So, thanks, see you next week.